Well, good evening. Good to be with everybody tonight. Good to see the Goebels and some others in the audience that I mentioned last night. You know how much I love you and thank you for being here. Sorry that we were a little bit late. I never saw people get so excited than when somebody looked down and said, "It's 6:45." Man, that table cleared out. And so two elders will have to come forward tonight. And the preacher, I'll come with them because I was telling him, just run the red light. Just go on. We got to get there. I've had that happen before. It's not the first time when I've been with people. And I've always just said, you know, what are they going to do? They're just going to have to wait till I get there. Or Don's going to have to preach. That's one or the other. Anyway, good to see everybody tonight. We can always learn, obviously, from the positive examples in the Bible, and we often do lessons about that, right? We do lessons about Timothy, for instance, or we study one of the other disciples, and we talk about the strong points of their life. But we also learn from the negative examples, and that's what we're going to do tonight. We want to look at three men who actually were men from the same time period when you think about it. Eli, Samuel, and David. Now, David probably not with Eli's, but with Samuel. They overlapped, at least, Samuel with both of them. And they came at a very crucial time in the history of God's people. But what the Bible tells us about them as fathers, I think, is instructive. Do you remember when the Challenger Endeavour launched? I can still see it in my mind. And as it got, higher in the sky, in that great blue sky, when all of a sudden you just saw it, just seemed like it exploded. There was just, and one of the rockets was just going crazy, and just all of a sudden it settles in on people that a disaster of monumental proportions has happened. I lived in Dallas when the other shuttle came in. And I can still remember hearing those huge sonic booms that you just never hear. I remember growing up in West Texas hearing it because of we had the military base, and you often heard that from those aircraft, but not anything. And I remember waking up in the morning hearing that, thinking, "Wow, I've never heard that." And what that was the shuttle was disintegrating over Texas. You remember all of the parts fell in Nacogdoches a lot, and in that area. From both of those disasters, when they found the pieces, you remember seeing the Time magazine article, I remember, of the picture of they almost were able to put at least the outline of the shuttle back together. There were pieces that they found. They were able to determine, for instance, that one that disintegrated, that one of the heat tiles had probably come loose and came off, and then the Challenger Endeavour, was the O-rings. The O-rings were not just these tiny, tiny things, but how crucial, how important. And you can bet that never was going to happen again. But the things you learn from the disasters is those things, at least, are not ever going to happen again, because they're going to solve it. They're going to put every effort into it. Well, that's what we want to do tonight when we look at these men, as we look at Eli and Samuel and David, and think about where they failed as fathers, and then what can we ourselves learn from that. So let's think about Samuel and Eli's sons. What the Bible tells us about Samuel is that basically his mother vowed, remember? She so wanted a male child. That was important in that culture. And she was barren, and she's praying, and Eli, remember the story, thinks she's drunk, but she's not. And Eli blesses her. Again, understanding as the high priest, there was more than just, I hope it happens to you. That he was truly passing on to her something that God would bless, and God did bless it. And she goes home and conceives, and then she had vowed to give him to God. She had vowed to lend him as long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Now that's what she had made, that she was going to have to hand him over. And remember, every year, her husband would go up for the feast, and she'd say, not now. When I wean him, and Hebrew women, if it's the Maccabees are correct, they nurse their children longer than we do. But he's a little boy, when she finally brings him and presents him to Eli and says, "This is the one. Do you remember that I was praying and that I vowed, and here he is, and I have lent him to the Lord for the rest of his days." Now, I want you to stop and think about that, ladies. What we're going to study about Hophni and Phinehas, the evil, wicked sons of Eli, and to think that you are turning your son, your little boy, over to that kind of house. Now, Eli in his character is not a flawed man from the standpoint of him doing what's right, personally, loving God, serving God. But what he will not do with his sons, that mars everything. That scarred everything about what was good in him. And it had to be knowledge that was widely known, because he will know it and express it to his sons. But Eli is given to God at that point and turned over to it. And so here you have the contrast, the first contrast that you have. And notice that it's the verses that are back to back. And the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest, but then the very next thing. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And that term worthless there, your version may have it footnoted, they were sons of Belial. Belial was a worthless idol. I mean, it would be about the worthless thing you could say about somebody who, to be the son of somebody was to be like them, right? To imbibe all that they are. So a son of a worthless, no good count idol that doesn't represent a living and true God and the power and the majesty and the mercy and the forgiveness. These men were that. The sons of Eli, and so that's why the English Standard, other versions may choose the word. They were worthless. There's no worth to them. They did not know the Lord. But contrast little Samuel. Samuel ministered to God in the presence. Now, what was it that made Eli's sons so wicked? Well, the verses that intervene in here tell us. Look at verse 14 and following. Well, let's pick up at verse 13. "And the custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered," this 1 Samuel 2, "offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would thrust it in the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot, and all that the fork brought up to the priest would take for himself." Remember that God fed the priests. There were certain sacrifices they were allowed to eat. They were allowed to take and eat. That's so that God provided, the people provided for the priests. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned. Why does it say that? Because the fat was the choice part. It was the part given to God. God alone got that part and other parts of the meat. And so before the fat, he says, moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificed, "Give meat for the priest to roast. He will not accept boiled meat from you after the sacrifice has been made, before the sacrifice, but only raw. And if the man said to him, 'Let them burn the fat first and then take as much as you wish,' he would say, 'No, you must give it now, and if you will not give it, I'll take it by force.'" I want you to stop and think about it. There's no other church in town. You can't go and say, "All right, these people are wicked. These people are doing what's wrong. I'm going to go over to another local church. They're doing what's right. They love God." There's no other church in town. Where do you go? These are the high priest's sons. These are the priests of God. They're causing people to disdain the sacrifice of God. They don't want to come offer their sacrifices because why should they? They get there and find out the priests are wicked men. They don't respect God. They're going to take your portion, the best of your portion that you're supposed to give to God first. So it just got to where they just didn't come. And so they're causing men to despise God and the offering. That's why he says they are worthless men. Moreover, if you drop down to verse 22, it says, Eli was very old and he kept hearing that all of his sons, were doing. You think other people didn't know? All these people that it was happening with their sacrifices, widely reported probably. But look what it says. And how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Apparently godly women that gave themselves to a task that had to be done at the temple or the tabernacle as we would understand it now. repairing maybe the rips and tears that could happen in the precious stuff that covered the tabernacle, and all kinds of other things that women probably could have better talent at, and they're serving. And these guys who are married are laying with them. I'm going to tell you, you can't think about a more wicked time. What happens when church leaders, elders, deacons, preacher, Bible class teacher become involved with some other woman in a congregation? You understand how bad that is, what happens to a congregation. But there is no other church in town. There's nowhere to go to escape these ungodly men. And so the last contrast is 1 Samuel 2:17. Notice it says, "Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt." But the very next verse, now the contrast with Samuel. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. And you remember the ephod represented what the priest wore. All right, so Samuel both could be priest and prophet to God's people. It represents that he can come before God. Remember how David would seek God. The Urim and Thummim were inside that ephod. And he would seek God's counsel, and he would say to the priest, Abiathar, bring the linen ephod. Because it represented his ability to contact God, to talk to God and ask yes and no questions, apparently. Shall I go up to this city? Will they deliver me? You can read later about that in David's life. So here is Samuel, who is serving God, representing God, trying to do, as a little kid, doing the right thing, contrasted with these wicked sons of Eli. And then the text tells us this: Eli heard of his son's sins. What if you're a father and you hear that your son or your sons are behaving so wickedly? What would you do? What should a godly father do? And mark it well, this isn't any godly father in Israel. This is the high priest, Eli. Long line that goes back to Aaron, handed down to the eldest son of the family, to the eldest son, to the eldest son. Eli stands in that distinguished place of the priests that go between God and the people, who offer the sacrifices that the people bring, who minister at the tabernacle, all the things that had to be done to worship God in that day, to teach the people. The priests were to be the teaching mechanism to the people of God from the law of Moses. And he hears about all of this, and what does he do? Nothing. And so God sends a prophet to him that says these words, "Why then do you scorn?" He says this to Eli. Eli, reminds you, is not doing it himself. He's not doing this personally. He is a godly man from that standpoint. He's not engaged in their sins himself, but it's what he's not doing. "Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves of the choicest parts of every offering, my people Israel?" Where does he lay the blame? That's what his sons were doing. He wasn't doing it, but God says you were. "Because you honored your sons more than me." I want you to stop and think about that for just a second. He sends another in 1 Samuel chapter 3. And says at verse 13, "For the iniquity that he knew, and he did not restrain them." He is high priest of Israel, right? Could he have stopped his sons? That wickedness that he knows, I can't imagine. What does he go home and tell Mrs. Eli about their boys? You know what? If he was a godly, truly righteous man, and he realizes his sons are filled with iniquity and they will not turn, he's talked to them, he's counseled them against it, and he's not getting anywhere with them, what's his next step in the law of Moses? Bring those sons before the congregation, accuse them of the sin they are committing, and then pick up the first stone to stone them to death. I don't even want to go there. Not even in my mind do I want to think about were I asked to do that in the Old Testament. But that's what you did with a rebellious son, right? You can read it in the law of Moses. A rebellious son who would not hear your entreaty, who would not repent, who would not show any desire to come to God. After you had done all you could do, that's the final step under the law of Moses. He is high priest of Israel. Can he stop this? Yeah. He can put a dead stop to the wickedness. And he does not. So when God comes through the prophet, he said, you, Eli, did this. Because he would not restrain his sons. Now fast forward to our day. We're not asked to bring our rebellious child before God and render such judgment. But is that judgment coming? If our children are just that rebellious, is there a day approaching when God will do exactly what He said He will do to all such that do not love Him? Yeah. But what are we doing? In Hebrews 12 and verse 6, there is this statement that says, "For the Lord disciplines the one He loves and chastises every son." What father is there among you, he says, who does not chastise his son? I've heard people talk about when they were a kid and they knew that they were going to have to get the mom would tell them the other day, one of the elders where I am told me a story about that when it said, when your dad gets home, you're going to get it. Now go in there and pick out the belt that you want to get a whooping by. And he said, boy, I thought I'd pick the thinnest belt possible. That'd be the one that wouldn't hurt. He said, man, was I wrong. He said, you pick a big wide one's not going to hurt. You remember the peach limbs, and people would go out and get that kind of thing, and just that little thing. But there was a discipline that had to happen. There was a chastisement that had to happen. You had disobeyed your parents, and there had to be a consequence to that. If God loves us and we are His sons, He's going to chastise His sons. How much more so does He demand that of us? So if you have a child who is rebellious against God, what have you done to restrain them? If you have a child, a son or a daughter that's not obeying God, what have you done to chastise them? What have you done to try to wake them up as a last-ditch effort to get them to understand if you don't wake up now, there's a day of judgment coming. It may come in time, by the way. God may deal with people now. But there is certainly a day coming that all such will be dealt with. I tell people sometimes, maybe the last thing you have before you is to pray that your children be chastised by God. If your children are I'm not saying necessarily they're in that such wickedness that these boys have done, but they're still away from God. And you've tried and you've talked and you've done everything, but have you prayed that God chastise them? Have you prayed that they get an illness that maybe will wake them up? Have you prayed that they will lose their job? That maybe if they get down to the bottom, they will wake up. Folks, every time I've preached a lesson like this, I've had somebody, at least at the home congregation, come out and say, I don't agree with you about that. I said, then tell me what Hebrews 12 verse 6 is saying. If God chastises His sons, why would He expect less of us as fathers? Every father, He says it in that text, every earthly father chastises the sons that he loves. God will do it. We must do it. And we do it for a purpose, for a reason. Because if we're like Eli and we know their sin and do not restrain them, what do you think God's going to say to us in the day of judgment? What will He do with us in the day of judgment? Have you ever thought about this passage in Matthew 10, verse 37? Whoever loves son or daughter more than me. Isn't that what He's saying to Eli? You're not worthy of me. Folks, can we love our children more than we love God? I believe more people will be lost at the day of judgment that are God's people, will be lost at the day of judgment because of this. Because they loved their son or daughter more than they loved God. Do you like Thanksgiving? Do you like the time of year when your kids are all going to come home and they're going to bring their grandkids and everybody's going to get around the table, or maybe it's Christmas time, or it's birthday? I believe verily that some of us want happy Thanksgivings over eternal salvation. We want everything to be smooth. We want everything to be happy. We want everybody to get along. And yet, sitting at our table are people that we know their sins and we have not restrained them. There may be people sitting at our table that if I loved them like the Lord, I would discipline them and I would chastise every son that is not doing what's right. There may be children sitting at our table and I look across and I realize that God may one day read that to me. You loved your son or daughter more than you loved me. God will brook no rivals, including our own children. And so He demands of us that we do, as fathers especially, what we must do. And it's not easy. And I have known people who have had to make hard decisions. And I pray that they made them as best they can when they had done everything they could do. They finally had to draw a line. I don't know how to tell you what practically that is. But I guarantee you there's something, right? There's something. Because He demanded it of Eli. He will demand it of us. The second guy that you read about, of course, is Samuel himself. And if there ever was a godly man in the children of Israel, it said the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. I'm going to talk about him personally. Jeremiah says this about him in chapter 15, verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my heart would not turn toward these people. And this is centuries later, under the prophet Jeremiah. He said, if Moses stood or if Samuel stood as intercessors between the people and their sins and me, I would not listen to either one of them. That's what God thought of Samuel. That's how much He thought of Samuel. There's nothing wrong about Samuel when you think about him standing before God. He stands as a man who is in character, was impeccable before God. He's a sinner like anyone else, but I'm saying he had a heart for God, and he wanted to, and he would repent of his own sins as he saw them, as a man should. And so he stands before God as a man who's honored. But here's his boys. The only time you read about his family. He puts two of his sons, maybe that's all he had. I don't know what I was trying to think now about the text. Yet his sons did not walk in his, Joel and Abijah were their names, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. And because of that, the people came to him and said, your sons are not like you. They're perverting justice, therefore give us a king. And it caused a huge shift, remember, and a huge turmoil when you consider the kind of king that came to them in Saul. And it all traced back to, if Joel and Abijah had been honest judges and had not perverted justice, would that led, at least at this point, to them asking for a king? Now, I don't know if Samuel was to blame for it. Here's what I know. He went on a circuit year by year. He judged Israel, and the elliptical dots there it just tells you the places where he went, where he judged, because that's what a prophet did, a priest did in judging the people of Israel. And remember, he's the last judge of Israel. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there. I don't know what happened to Joel and Abijah, and I can't tell you as I can with Eli, because the text tells us that Eli was responsible. Eli didn't do what he ought to do. But I'm going to put something together here, and you just have to decide if you think there's enough evidence for that. Is it possible that he was not home and his boys, he was just too busy with the work of God to raise a family? If you're going to raise a family, you got to be involved with them. Well, I had an uncle that had to fly a lot to places, as all people do if they work for companies and they get on up in it and they have to go here and there. But Uncle Joe would always fly back home. If he had to be at a meeting the next day, he would fly home. If his boys were playing ball, he'd fly home at his own expense. He'd drive and watch them play. He'd go back to the airport, get on a plane, and get back to the place where he was so he could go to the business meeting he'd have the next day. Now, he took a risk, didn't he? But he loved his boys, and he knew how important it was to be involved in their lives, to build that relationship, to not put work first, to remember that God had given him these men, these young men, to bring them up in the Lord and be involved with them. I remember asking Brother Haley, that name probably doesn't mean much to people who are young, those of us that might have known him as a person. Remember some of the stories that he told, that he said, and if there ever was somebody who taught and tried to teach the people of God and bring the Word of God to the masses of God's people, he was one of those. But he would tell you that he was so busy with the work of God that he lost his family. I've heard preachers tell that story, not just Brother Haley. I've heard many other preachers tell that same story. That they can get so busy with the work of God that they're not spending the time they need to spend as fathers. You have to be with your family. You have to understand how vital it is that they see you and you're involved with what they do, because that will be the difference between whether most of the time they choose to follow God or not. And is it possible that he was so busy with the work of God that he wasn't with Joel and Abijah, and that they became men of that kind of character? Maybe. The story told of a young executive who was climbing up the corporate ladder, spending 60 and 70 hours a week at his job. Came home one night early, heard Mom up in the bathroom giving a bath to the 3-year-old and the 18-month-old, and they were splashing in the tub, and he walks in, and he said, "Well, what's going on in here?" And the 3-year-old looked up at him and said, "Who are you?" And he sort of laughed, and he said, "Well, I'm your daddy." And then he was pierced to the heart. She said to him, "We don't have a daddy," because they never saw him. That got that young guy's attention. He decided to take a demotion and be with his family. You have a choice. Are people going to remember you because you made millions for the company? I want you, the guys that have retired, to think about it. Jonathan works for J.B. Hunt, and all out in their parking lot are flags on poles of truckers that drove 1 million miles for the company. I want you to stop and think about that. You stop and think of how many years it would take to accomplish that. There are not many flags in those poles, but they're out there. There's a lot of them. That company's been in business for 60 years. Jonathan says when a guy reaches that 1 million mile marker, the whole company, all the executives, everybody comes to the lobby, huge lobby, where you enter the company's building, and they all applaud him. There's a big ceremony. His name's going to go up on the flag. I take Jonathan there every now and then because I have the 4-wheel drive when we have winter weather up where we are, and I look at those flags and I wonder, 5 years from now, does anybody remember who those guys are? 10 years from now, do you think anybody remembers who the guys are? Do you think 20 years after a chief executive leaves the company, anybody really cares? If you built the company, do you think they care? Thomas Jefferson, at the end of his life, had to write to the Virginia legislatures to demand that they give him certain things that he was owed, and he had to write them like he was some little bitty guy that came in from just yesterday, not wet behind the ears. And he wrote to another friend and said, they don't even know who we are. This is Thomas Jefferson saying that about his generation. It never will change. Do you want to be remembered for making a pile of money or doing all the things you could do with that pile of money? Or do you want to be remembered that you raised faithful sons and daughters? What do you want your legacy to be? The last guy in this list, of course, is David, and we know the terrible example that happened with him, with Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah. Do you remember when he sinned with Bathsheba? The prophet said to him, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me by what he had done. And so one by one you see the terrible story. Amnon, remember, raped his half-sister Tamar. But it says of King David, when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But he did nothing. It just said he got mad about it. He got really mad about it. But he didn't go to Amnon. He didn't upbraid Amnon. He could have stopped what Absalom was going to plot in his heart had he dealt with Amnon the way he should have dealt with him. But he didn't. He didn't do anything except get mad. So Absalom harbors in his heart resentment toward him, calls all the king's sons 2 years later to a party he throws, instructs his servants to rise up and kill Amnon at his signal and don't hurt anyone else. All the other king's sons fled back. A messenger gets there before and says he's killed all the king's sons. It was a false message. He had only killed Amnon, and then he flees. He's taking his vengeance for his full sister, Tamar. But God's prophet had spoken to him in 1 Samuel 12, saying, thus says the Lord, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. You did this in secret. He shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. I'll make everybody know. And that's exactly what Absalom did, remember? He went into the concubines of David in the presence of all Israel, on the top of the roof, the flat roofs of the houses there in the palace. God punished David through his son Absalom. And Absalom wanted to kill his father. Can you imagine a worse idea of thinking? I can't imagine my son Jonathan thinking in terms of that he would want to kill me. If Absalom could have gotten hold of David, that's what he would have done. And then finally, Adonijah, after Absalom dies, rises up, and you remember that Absalom was in line to be king. There was Amnon, but Amnon had been killed. Chileab, we don't know about. He just disappears. Remember, that was the son he had with Abigail. So they're Amnon, Chileab, Absalom, Adonijah. Adonijah, not Solomon. Adonijah ought to be king. So Adonijah does what? He does the same thing Absalom did. He gets this big chariot. He just has a lot of guys in front of him. You know, he's a good-looking guy, like it described Absalom. Same kind of handsome fella, man, politician to the core. And then the text says, his father had not rebuked him at any time. Does that sound like Eli? Had not rebuked him at any time. Does that sound like what he didn't do with Amnon? His father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, "Why have you done so?" How many times do we find fathers who are weak? Fathers who do not do what they ought to do with their family. When it comes time to say, "This is wrong," God requires that of me, of the father, the husband, the head of my home. I am required to take care of my family. And if that means I must chastise them as God does, then I have to be that person. But here was what was wrong with David. His sin with Bathsheba had weakened him. How does he go to Amnon when he's done the same thing that Amnon did? How does he go to Absalom when he's done the same thing that Absalom did? He killed Uriah just like Absalom killed his brother Amnon. How does he go to Adonijah when he has so weakened himself? David may have been a man after God's own heart, but as a father, he was a complete failure. What we need to see in that is lessons that we can learn. So what can we learn tonight? First of all, love demands discipline. Early, consistent, in the right amount. Folks, we have to discipline our family. We have to discipline our children. You know where that starts? My mother-in-law was asked one time by a young lady, said, "When should I start with my child, knowing that they're doing the wrong thing? How soon must I start disciplining? If it means I need to swat them, if it means I need to make it uncomfortable for them, they want something, they're not going to get that something because they've been doing what's wrong." My mother-in-law asked her, said, "How early are they disobeying?" I mean, that turning of the heart, if I've watched it the other night, one of our elders said at home, he said, "You know, I was sitting and I thought about turning around. This little kid kept saying to his mother and to his dad, 'No, I'm not. No, I'm not.'" So they all come to my office on Wednesday night. They only get goldfish on Wednesday night because if I give sugar candy to them, then the moms get mad at me. But Sunday night, they know they can get candy. So I've got all these I've got M&Ms, I've got gummy bears, I've just got a virtual candy store. And part of that is building a relationship always with the kids. So they come, they say, "Mr. Chuck, can we have candy?" So I went up to this family and I said, "You know what?" I said, "Use me." I said, "If they say no to you, say, 'Mr. Chuck's not going to give you any candy, and I'll be right there with you.'" We've got to discipline them. And if it means by the SWAT or withholding from them something they want, to teach them what is right and wrong. I'm talking about little kids that are this size. Because if they can tell you no, you got to do something about it. Love demands intimacy. My family first. God, you understand, is all important. But God's commanded me to that. And my family's what I'm going to leave to this world. That's the legacy that I pass on. And it's far more important than my job. Love shows how to live by the being holy as God is holy. If I weaken myself like David did, then what kind of example am I going to be before my family? Can I ever overcome it? David had made such a mess of his life that it was hard for that to happen. I must take care to build holiness in my heart so that I can be the right example for my family. And then understand that our failure affects history. A local church, is no stronger than the individual families that make it up, right? We're only as strong as each family that I could look at this congregation and say, your unit is so important. Because as goes the families in the congregation, so goes the local church. Eli's immorality in his family, his unrest that he caused because of it, ultimately led to Philistine victory and stealing the very ark of God. Samuel, a change in the form of government, let us have a king because your sons are wicked, led to a national crisis. And David, Civil war. The church is no stronger in the long run than the families that make it up. The last point that I want to emphasize, and that'll be our lesson tomorrow morning, is not every rebellious child can be traced back to parents. Now, I want you to understand that. Sometimes we use Proverbs 22:6 as an absolute. Train up a child in the way he's going, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Folks, if that's absolute, then the impossibility of apostasy is what that teaches. These are not absolutes in the Proverbs. They are maxims. That's the way it almost always is. But it's not absolute. Because if it was absolute, that means they could never apostatize. They could never walk away from God. It would also mean that all of it depends on the teacher and relatively little on the student. But it takes both. The student must love God and honor God and obey God. And Jesus, the master teacher, lost one of his own, didn't he? And he was the chief shepherd. So never think, and it's the most guilt-laden trip that we'll ever walk in this life, is we will always blame ourselves as parents if our children go away. And while that is sometimes the reason, it's not always the reason. And we need to be honest about that. We need to know that in my heart of hearts, I've done everything that I possibly could have done to bring them back. And I chastised them when I know I should have chastised them. But they still rebelled against God. At the end of the day, every heart decides. And our children can decide. But while I have them in my home, while I have control of them, we need to not make the mistakes of these men. Do y'all know where Itasca, Texas is? Anybody in here know where Itasca is? If you go up 35W to Fort Worth, you'll see Itasca. It's just off of 35W. Back in the day when Itasca was before World War II, they had a terrible fire. Nobody ever really remembers this. They remember New London, Texas. You remember the school that blew up in the 30s because gas leaked out. And if it had just happened a few minutes later, all the kids would have been gone. But it blew up with hundreds of kids in that school and teachers, and I think there were 300 that were killed or terribly injured. It was awful. Do you know out of that, natural gas doesn't have an odor? But that's why odor was added to gas, so that you could smell it, and that maybe that would not happen again. But that's why that came about. But New London overshadowed Itasca. Nobody remembers Itasca. Itasca had a horrible fire that consumed a wooden structure in just record minutes and killed, I think it was 150. It wasn't as many as New London, 160. I forgot what the total was, but it was awful. And after they buried all of the little kids and tried to get over the tragedy, World War II happened. And then nothing happened because of our consuming need to win that war. And then after, like every place in the nation, we began to boom. We were the only nation left that hadn't been ravaged by war, and the boom was unbelievable. And so the school grew, and it had to add on. But at the point where they added on, they had decided when they rebuilt that they would never let that tragedy happen again. They would supply the world, at that time, the world's best sprinkler fire alarm system that could be bought. Money was no problem. People would donate whatever needed to be donated. The best technology at the time was put into the original school, the one that was rebuilt. That tragedy would never happen again. And then as they grew, they had to add on to the school. A decade later, I don't remember the exact time period, but they had to add a big addition on. One day, the plumber that was in charge of the entire affair of adding on to it came running into the superintendent's office. He was just red of face, upset, tears were coming down his cheeks. And he looked at the superintendent and he said, "I don't know how this possibly could have happened. But the world's most advanced sprinkler system was never hooked up to the water supply. They had lived under the false idea that everything was okay. Too many families among God's people live under the false impression that everything's okay. It's only okay if we're hooked up to the water supply, if we're hooked up to God. That's the only okay there is. Are you leading your family? Or are you making the mistakes of Eli, Samuel, and David? Pray not. Learn from the Bible, from the mistakes of others, that we not duplicate them. I will praise you with all